When a hardened Montana rancher hires a cook to survive a deadly winter, the stagecoach doesn't deliver a rugged stranger. It delivers the woman who broke his heart 5 years ago, clutching a shivering 4-year-old boy who stares back at him with his exact steel-gray eyes. Trapped by a brutal blizzard, hidden secrets, and a ruthless cattle baron, he must risk everything to save the family he never knew he had. Today's tale is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't found in isolation, but in the courage to forgive and fight for those we love. If you believe in second chances and love that conquers the harshest winters, please hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story with a friend. Let us know in the comments what you love most about the Wild West. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community. Now, let's ride into the storm.
The wind tearing across the Montana high country didn't just blow, it hunted. It shrieked down through the jagged peaks, carrying a cold so vicious it felt like ground glass against exposed skin. Cade Sterling stood on the frozen planks of his porch, his shearling collar pulled tight against his jaw. He narrowed his eyes against the blinding whiteout, his breath pluming in thick, heavy clouds. He was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape, scarred, calloused, and currently nursing a temper as foul as the weather. He was waiting for a cook. The agency in Helena was supposed to send a grizzled, thick-skinned camp cook who could survive 6 months of absolute isolation without losing his mind. Cade needed hands to chop wood, boil beans, and keep the hearth fires burning while he fought to keep his cattle alive through the brutal winter of 1884. Then he heard it. Through the howling gale came the agonizing, rhythmic crunch of wooden wagon wheels grinding over solid ice. A stagecoach materialized from the swirling white void, its horses steaming and foam-flecked, fighting for every inch of ground. The driver, bundled so thickly he looked like a bear, hauled back on the reins. The coach skidded to a halt in the yard, the leather harnesses snapping like pistol shots in the frigid air. "Sterling!" the driver roared over the wind, his voice muffled by layers of wool. "Got your cook! Barely made it through the pass. I ain't staying." Cade stepped off the porch, his boots crunching through the crust of the snow. "Better be worth the wait, driver. Tell the bastard to grab his gear." The heavy wooden door of the coach groaned open on frozen hinges. But it wasn't a burly, bearded man who stepped out into the knee-deep snow. It was a woman. The visual contrast struck Cade like a physical blow. She wore a faded, dark wool traveling dress that stood out starkly against the blinding white wilderness. A heavy shawl was wrapped securely around her shoulders, and a woolen bonnet shadowed her face. But the moment she lifted her chin to face the driving wind, Cade stopped dead in his tracks. The breath vanished from his lungs. Elara Vance, the ghost from a dimly lit boarding house in Denver. 5 years ago, back when he had still possessed a shred of reckless youth, back before the harsh realities of the Sterling legacy had dragged him back to Montana and hardened him into stone. She looked different. The softness of the city girl he barely remembered was gone, replaced by a fierce, brittle edge. Her cheekbones were sharp, her skin pale from the cold, but her dark eyes held a defiant fire that dared the storm to strike her down. Cade couldn't speak. His mind spun, desperately trying to calculate the impossibility of her standing in his yard. But the shock was only beginning. Elara turned back to the dark interior of the coach. She reached out, her bare, reddened hands grasping something small. A moment later, a child stepped down into the snow beside her. He was a tiny thing, no more than 4 years old, drowning in an oversized wool coat that had clearly been patched and repatched. The boy shivered violently, his small gloved hand immediately gripping the dark fabric of Elara's skirt. The wind seemed to die in Cade's ears. The crushing silence of the frontier pressed in on him. The boy tilted his head, peering out from beneath a knit cap to study the towering, scarred rancher standing before him. When the child looked up, Cade felt the earth drop out from beneath his boots. They were his eyes. The exact, piercing, steel-gray eyes of the Sterling bloodline. The same stubborn set of the jaw, the same quiet, assessing stare that Cade saw every time he looked in a mirror. Panic, guilt, and a terrifying, sudden possessiveness slammed into Cade's chest. He took a stumbling step forward, his voice a raw rasp. "Elara, what is this? Is he?" Elara didn't flinch. She didn't cower. And she certainly didn't look at him with the warmth of a reunited lover. She looked at him the way a trapped wolf looks at a hunter. She pulled the boy slightly behind her leg, shielding him from the wind and from Cade. "I saw your name on the agency's ledger," Elara said. Her voice cut through the howling wind, cold, flat, and stripped of any illusion. "Elara," Cade choked out, staring at the boy. "You should have told me. You should have—" "I did what I had to do to keep us alive," she interrupted, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. She didn't drop her gaze. "I'm not here for an apology. And I'm not here for a husband. I heard you pay a fair wage, and the housing is warm." Cade stared at the woman he had abandoned, and the son he had never known existed. The stagecoach driver tossed two battered leather trunks into the snow, snapped his reins, and drove the team back toward the pass, abandoning them to the isolation of the mountains. The storm roared back to life, swirling snow around the three of them. Elara reached down, picking up the nearest trunk by its leather strap. She leveled a glare at Cade that carried the weight of 5 years of solitary hell. "I'm here for the cook's wages, Cade," she said, her voice echoing with gritty, uncompromising resolve. "Pay me, and don't you dare touch my boy." The cold inside the cabin was a living, breathing entity. It seeped through the chinking in the log walls and settled heavy on the floorboards, waiting to bite bare feet. Cade woke an hour before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of solitary survival. But as he swung his legs out from beneath his heavy quilts, the smell of chicory coffee and wood smoke told him he was no longer alone. He pulled on his boots and walked out into the main room. The sight stopped him dead. Elara was already out in the blinding white of the yard. Through the frost-rimed window, Cade watched her. She had stripped off her heavy shawl to allow her arms to move, her dark wool dress a stark slash of shadow against the endless snow. She was wielding his heavy splitting axe, bringing it down on a chunk of frozen pine. The axe was too heavy for her. The blade struck off-center, glancing off the frozen wood and jarring her shoulders. Cade saw her wince, saw the puff of white vapor as she let out a frustrated breath, but she simply reset her stance and hefted the heavy iron head again. She was proving a point. She hadn't come for charity. Cade threw open the cabin door. The wind howled, instantly biting at his face. He crossed the yard in 4 long strides and caught the handle of the axe just as she raised it for another swing. Elara jumped, her eyes flashing with instant defensive fire. "Let go, Cade." "It's 20 below zero, Elara." His voice was a low, gravelly rasp over the wind. "You'll tear your shoulders apart before you split that pine. I hired a cook, not a lumberjack." "I earn my keep," she shot back, her knuckles white where she gripped the hickory handle. "All of it. I don't owe you, and I won't be beholden to you." He stared down at her. Her lips were blue from the cold, her bare hands scraped and raw. The stubborn pride radiating from her was a tangible force. Slowly, he loosened his grip on the axe. "The woodpile is my job," Cade said softly, the fight draining out of him. "Go inside. The boy needs you." At the mention of Leo, Elara's defiance faltered. She released the axe, wrapped her arms around herself, and hurried back toward the warmth of the cabin. Cade watched her go, the heavy knot in his chest pulling tighter. He drove the axe into the pine with a single, violent swing, splitting the log cleanly in 2. For the rest of the day, the tension inside the small cabin was suffocating. Elara worked with relentless efficiency. She tamed the cracked, temperamental cast-iron stove, turning Cade's meager winter rations of salted pork, beans, and flour into a hearty stew. She moved around Cade's space like a phantom, avoiding his gaze, speaking only when absolutely necessary. But Cade couldn't look away from the boy. Leo sat on a braided rug near the hearth, watching Cade with wide, solemn gray eyes. The child didn't play. He observed. He tracked Cade's every movement, from the way he oiled his boots to the way he fed the fire. It physically ached to look at him. This was his blood. A son who had spent 4 years in the brutal slums of Denver, entirely without a father. Night fell fast and hard in the mountains. With the darkness came the wolves. Their howling started out on the eastern ridge, a haunting, unified chorus of hungry predators echoing through the icy canyon. Sitting on the rug, Leo flinched. The boy scrambled backward, his small hands desperately grabbing fistfuls of Ilara's skirt as she stood at the stove. He buried his face in the dark wool, trembling. Cade, who had been sitting by the lantern light carving a piece of soft cedar, stopped. He set his knife down and stood up. Ilara immediately tensed, shifting her weight to place herself between Cade and the boy. Cade ignored the warning in her eyes. He crouched down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening, until he was at eye level with the terrified child. "Leo," Cade said, his voice a low, steady rumble meant to soothe spooked horses. The boy peeked out from the folds of his mother's skirt. Cade held out his large, calloused hand. Resting on his palm was a small, smoothly sanded wooden dagger. The edges were blunt, the hilt perfectly carved to fit a tiny fist. "Wolves don't come near the fire," Cade said, holding the boy's gaze with his own identical gray eyes. "But out here, a man needs a blade to protect his mother anyway. Think you can handle this one?" Leo stared at the wooden knife. Slowly, hesitantly, he released his mother's dress. He reached out, his tiny, trembling fingers brushing against the rough calluses of Cade's palm. A jolt went straight through Cade's heart. Leo took the dagger. He gripped the hilt tightly, his small jaw setting into a familiar, stubborn line. He gave Cade a single, serious nod. Above them, Ilara let out a shaky breath. Cade looked up and saw the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes before she quickly turned her face away, hiding her vulnerability behind a mask of cold indifference. Later that night, the storm worsened. Cade stepped out into the blizzard one last time to check the barn, ensuring the livestock were secure against the plunging temperatures. When he returned, he opened the cabin door as silently as possible, not wanting to wake the boy. The cabin was submerged in deep shadows, lit only by the flickering, dying embers of the hearth. Cade stepped inside and froze. Ilara was kneeling on the floor in front of the fire. She had pushed her dark dress and chemise down to her waist, using a ragged cloth and a tin basin of warmed water to wash the grime of the journey from her skin. Cade's boots were silent on the floorboards. He was about to turn away, to step back out into the freezing wind to give her privacy, when the firelight flared. The orange glow washed over Ilara's bare back. Cade's breath caught in his throat like a swallowed stone. Crisscrossing her pale skin were jagged, faded white lines. They were brutal, undeniable raised scars, the kind left by a heavy leather belt or a horsewhip. They mapped a history of violence and suffering that Cade could scarcely comprehend. While he had been out here in Montana fighting the weather and building his cattle empire, the woman who had carried his child had been enduring hell. She hadn't just struggled in Denver. She had been brutalized. A wave of nausea and blinding white-hot rage crashed over him. His hands balled into fists so tight his knuckles cracked. He wanted to kill whoever had put those marks on her. But deeper than the rage was a crushing, suffocating guilt. He wasn't there. Cade backed out of the cabin, closing the heavy oak door silently between them. He stood on the freezing porch, letting the brutal Montana wind rip through him, feeling for the first time that the cold he deserved was far worse than the winter could ever provide. The blizzard did not break. For 3 days, it battered the cabin, a relentless, shrieking assault that turned the Montana frontier into a claustrophobic white prison. The wind clawed at the log, chinking, and the heavy glass panes of the windows rattled continuously in their frames, a chaotic, nerve-fraying percussion that mirrored the suffocating tension inside. Elara pushed herself with a punishing mechanical drive. She baked hardtack, boiled salted beef, and scrubbed the rough-hewn floorboards until her knuckles bled. She moved like a woman who believed that if she stopped working for even a second, the harsh reality of her situation would swallow her whole. Cade watched her, a silent sentinel in the corner of the room. Ever since the night he had seen the brutal landscape of scars across her back, his anger had completely evaporated, replaced by a sickening heavy guilt. He tried to help her, carrying in the water, hauling the heaviest logs, but she met every gesture with a wall of freezing, polite indifference. But the human body, no matter how fiercely willed, has its limits. It happened on the evening of the fourth day. Cade was sitting by the hearth, meticulously oiling his Winchester rifle. Leo was a few feet away, seated cross-legged on the rug, his small hands turning the wooden dagger Cade had carved for him over and over, studying the grain of the wood. At the stove, Elara reached up to lift a heavy iron kettle of boiling water. Cade heard the sharp, sudden hitch in her breath. He looked up just in time to see her knees buckle. "Elara!" Cade dropped the rifle. It hit the floorboards with a dull thud as he lunged across the room. He caught her just before she hit the cast-iron stove, her dead weight collapsing into his chest. The kettle tipped, splashing boiling water hissing across the hot iron, missing her by inches. "Mama!" Leo scrambled up, his wooden dagger clattering to the floor, his gray eyes wide with sudden, stark terror. "It's all right, Leo. Stay back," Cade ordered, his voice remarkably steady despite the panic spiking in his veins. He scooped Elara up into his arms. She weighed practically nothing, a fragile collection of sharp bones and sheer willpower hidden beneath the thick wool of her dress. But it was the heat radiating from her skin that terrified him. She was burning up, her face flushed a dark, unnatural crimson, sweat matting the dark hair against her forehead. The sheer exhaustion of the journey, combined with the brutal cold and her relentless labor, had finally broken her. Cade carried her into his bedroom, the only one with a bed large enough, and laid her down on the heavy quilt. "Leo," Cade called out, turning to look at the trembling boy in the doorway. He needed to keep the child calm, give him a purpose. "I need a brave scout right now. Can you be my scout?" Leo swallowed hard, his little chest heaving, but he gave a stiff nod. "Good man. Bring me the clean rags from the basin and the bucket of snow I brought in earlier. Hurry." As Leo darted off, Cade quickly and respectfully unbuttoned the high collar of Elara's dress to help her breathe, pulling the thick wool down off her shoulders. He soaked a rag in the melting snow Leo brought him and pressed the icy cloth to her forehead, her neck, her wrists. Hours bled into the night. The storm outside raged on, rattling the window panes like skeletal fingers demanding entry. Leo eventually fell asleep curled in an armchair near the bed, completely exhausted by his own fear. Cade did not move. He sat in a wooden chair pulled tight to the mattress, continuously changing the cold compresses, watching Elara's chest rise and fall with shallow, rapid breaths. Around midnight, the delirium set in. The ironclad defenses Elara had built around herself melted away under the scorching heat of the fever. She began to toss and turn, her head thrashing against the pillow. She was trapped in a nightmare, murmuring frantic, broken words. "No, please, the rent. The—" She whimpered, her hands clenching into fists, fighting invisible ghosts. "I can work. My hands are fine. Please don't take it." Cade leaned forward, his heart breaking in his chest. "Elara, you're safe. You're in Montana. You're safe." He reached out, gently gripping her flailing hands to keep her from hurting herself. The moment his calloused skin touched hers, her eyes flew open. They were glassy, unfocused, staring right through him, into a past he hadn't been there to protect her from. She gripped his shirt with a desperate, terrifying strength. Her knuckles turned white as she pulled him down closer to her face. "Please," she choked out, a ragged broken sob tearing from her throat. "Please don't burn them." Cade froze. "Burn what, Ilara? No one is burning anything." "The letters," she wept, tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracing hot paths down her flushed cheeks. "My letters. I used my last coins for the postage. Please, postmaster, please send them. Please send." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Cade couldn't breathe. "Letters?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Ilara's grip on his shirt tightened until the fabric tore. "I begged him," she sobbed, completely lost to the fevered memory. "I begged Cade to come. I told him about the baby. I told him we were starving. 5 letters. Why didn't he come? Why did he let them freeze?" Cade felt as if he had been shot at close range. 5 letters. I told him about the baby. We were starving. He staggered back, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. He stared at the woman, thrashing on his bed, the pieces of a horrifying 5-year-old puzzle violently snapping into place. He had spent the last 5 years in a bitter, hardened shell, convincing himself that the beautiful girl from Denver had simply used him and moved on, tossing him aside because he was just a rough, uncultured cowboy. When she had showed up on his porch 3 days ago, he had been furious that she had hidden his son from him. But she hadn't hidden Leo. She had begged for him. She had spent her last pennies, starving in the freezing Denver slums, crying out for the man who had promised her the world in the dark of a boarding house room. And Cade had never received a single word. Who? The question pounded in his skull, deafening against the roar of the blizzard outside. Who intercepted the mail? The answer hit him with the force of a runaway train. His father, old Silas Sterling, who had still been alive 5 years ago, controlling the ranch, controlling the mail that came through the pass, controlling Cade's life with an iron fist, convinced that no gutter trash seamstress would ever sink her hooks into the Sterling name. Cade dropped to his knees beside the bed. The rugged, stoic rancher who had weathered stampedes and Indian raids broke completely. He took Ilara's burning, scarred hand in both of his, pressing it against his mouth as his broad shoulders shook. "I didn't know," Cade whispered into the dark, his tears hot against her skin. "God forgive me, Ilara. I never got them. I never knew." The wind battered the cabin, but the true storm had finally broken inside. Cade looked from the scarred, feverish woman on the bed to the sleeping boy in the chair who possessed his eyes. The anger he had harbored was dead, replaced by a terrifying, absolute protective instinct, and a burning need to tear his own legacy apart to find the truth. The storm outside had dulled to a low, sullen moan by dawn, leaving the cabin buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. Inside the bedroom, the suffocating heat of the fever had finally broken. Ilara lay motionless on the heavy quilt, her skin pale but cool, her breathing deep and even in the healing depths of exhausted sleep. Curled beside her, Leo was still dead to the world, his small hand clutching the wooden dagger. Cade stood in the doorway, his eyes bloodshot, his body aching from a night spent battling the fever. But there was no exhaustion in his mind, only a frantic, tearing desperation. 5 letters. I begged him. He left the bedroom silently, closing the door until it just clicked. He walked to the center of the main room, his eyes lifting to the ceiling. Above the heavy pine rafters was the attic, a freezing, cramped crawl space where Cade had shoved the last remnants of his father's life after the old man's heart had given out 3 years ago. Elias Sterling had been a tyrant of a man, ruling his land and his son with an iron fist and a heart as cold as a Montana winter. Cade pulled the wooden ladder down from the ceiling hatch. The hinges shrieked in the quiet cabin. He climbed, pushing his shoulders through the narrow opening into the freezing, stale darkness. The air up here tasted of dust, dry rot, and old leather. Slicing through the gloom were thin, blinding shafts of morning light piercing the gaps in the eaves. Cade grabbed a kerosene lantern, struck a match with a trembling hand, and let the yellow glow spill over the graveyard of his father's legacy. He went straight for the heavy brass-bound trunk pushed into the furthest corner. Cade threw back the lid. The smell of mothballs and stale tobacco hit him instantly. He tore through old ledgers, property deeds, and rigid starched collars. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, only that his father had been a paranoid, calculating man who never threw anything away that he could use as leverage. At the bottom of the trunk lay Elias's heavy buffalo hide winter coat. Cade hauled the massive garment out. It was stiff with age. He drove his hands into the deep pockets. Empty. He ran his calloused fingers along the thick wool lining, tracing the heavy seams there. On the inside breast panel, the stitching had been meticulously sliced open, creating a hidden makeshift pocket. Cade's breath seized in his throat. He reached his fingers into the dark tear in the fabric. His fingertips brushed against something stiff, something paper. He pulled it out. Dust motes danced in the freezing shaft of light as Cade stared at what he held in his shaking hands. It was a stack of 5 envelopes, yellowed and brittle, tied together with a cheap, frayed piece of twine. Slowly, Cade turned the bundle over. The postage stamps were canceled. The postmark read, Denver, Colorado Territory. And the handwriting, elegant, sloping, and increasingly hurried on the later envelopes, was Ilara's. None of the wax seals had been broken. Elias Sterling hadn't even cared enough to read them. He had simply recognized the return address of a poor seamstress, paid off the stagecoach courier, and buried them. Cade sank to the dusty floorboards, his long legs giving out entirely. The freezing air of the attic bit into his lungs as he slipped the twine off the bundle. With a thumb that shook violently, he broke the seal of the very first envelope. The paper crinkled loudly. The date was over 4.5 years ago. Cade, I pray this reaches you. I went to the boarding house, but the landlady said you had ridden north. I am writing because I am frightened, and because you promised me that night that if I ever needed you, you would come. I am with child, Cade. Your child. The seamstress shop let me go when I began to show. I have enough saved for 2 months of rent, but no more. Please come back for us. Yours, Ilara. A ragged, agonizing sound tore from Cade's throat, the sound of a man having his soul ripped in half. He tore open the next one, and the next. With every letter, the ink became more erratic, the desperation bleeding through the page. She told him about Leo's birth. She told him about the freezing boarding house room, about watering down her thin broth so the baby could have milk. The final letter, dated just over a year after he had left her, was stained with what looked like dried tears. This is the last coin I have for a stamp. They are turning us out into the street tomorrow. I thought you were a good man. I thought the things you whispered in the dark were true. I will survive, Cade Sterling, because I have a son who has your steel-gray eyes, and I will not let him die in the gutter. But I will never, so long as I breathe, forgive you. Cade dropped the letters. He buried his face in his large, rough hands, weeping in the freezing dark of the attic. He wept for the boy who had starved while Cade had been drinking whiskey and branding cattle. He wept for the woman whose back was crisscrossed with scars she had earned just to keep his son alive. He had hated her for 5 years for abandoning him, while she had been dying by inches, waiting for a savior who never rode in. When Cade climbed back down the ladder, he was a fundamentally altered man. The arrogant, hardened cowboy was dead. He walked into the bedroom. Ilara was awake. She had managed to push herself up against the wooden headboard, her dark hair a tangled mess over her shoulders. She looked exhausted, her eyes bruised with fatigue. But the moment she saw Cade, her spine stiffened with that familiar brittle pride. Then she saw his face. Cade looked like he had been dragged through hell. His face was streaked with dust and dried tears, his gray eyes hollowed out with a grief so profound it made Ilara's breath catch. In his hands, he held a stack of yellowed papers. Ilara's eyes locked onto the envelopes. The color instantly drained from her already pale face. She shrank back against the headboard, a defensive, terrified instinct taking over. She threw an arm protectively across the sleeping boy beside her. "You had them," she whispered, her voice cracking, laced with sudden, absolute venom. "You had them all along. You kept them to mock me. Elara, look at them." Cade's voice was a gravelly, broken whisper. He crossed the room and fell to his knees beside the bed. The loud thud of his knees hitting the floorboards made her jump. He didn't try to touch her. He gently laid the 5 letters on the edge of the quilt, right by her hand. Elara stared at them. Her eyes darted to the wax seals. They were freshly broken. The edges of the paper were still crisp where he had just ripped them open. "They were in the attic," Cade said, the words scraping out of his throat. "Sewn into the lining of my father's buffalo coat. He intercepted the mail from the Denver stage. He hid them from me, Elara. I didn't know. Before God, I swear to you, I didn't know." Elara stopped breathing. Her trembling hand reached out, her raw fingers tracing the faded ink of her own handwriting. She looked at the fresh tears on the paper, realizing they weren't hers. They were his. "He hid them?" she breathed, the horror of the revelation crashing over her. 5 years. He let us starve because I was poor? "Because he was a monster," Cade said fiercely, his eyes blazing with a self-loathing that burned hotter than the stove in the next room. "And I was a blind, arrogant fool who didn't fight hard enough to find you." Elara looked down at Cade. The man kneeling before her was surrendering everything. His pride, his defenses, his ego. "I spent 5 years hating you for not fighting for me," Cade whispered, looking at the scars barely hidden beneath the collar of her dress. "And you were fighting a war I couldn't even imagine." He didn't reach for her hand. He knew he hadn't earned the right to touch her. He stayed on his knees, his gray eyes locked onto hers with a fierce, unwavering intensity. "I'm not asking you to forgive me, Elara. I know a few words can't erase a horsewhip or a freezing night in the slums. I don't deserve your forgiveness." Cade slowly pushed himself up to his feet. He looked down at the sleeping boy, then back to the woman who had fought the world to keep him alive. "But you are done fighting alone," Cade vowed, his voice ringing with a heavy, unshakable finality. "From this day until they put me in the ground, I am going to bleed to give you and Leo the life my family stole from you. You are on Sterling land now, and no one will ever hurt you again." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Elara sitting in the quiet warmth, staring at the letters that had finally found their way home. The screech of frozen, rusted barbed wire snapping taut against a cedar post cut through the howling wind like a dying animal. Cade Sterling hauled back on the heavy iron wire stretchers, his muscles trembling under the thick layers of his shearling coat. The temperature had plunged to 10 below zero, turning the Montana air into a brittle, lung-scorching knife. The rusted barb slipped, slicing cleanly through his leather glove and biting deep into the meat of his palm. Cade didn't even flinch. He didn't swear. He just clamped his jaw, pulled the wire tighter until the wooden post groaned, and drove a steel staple into the wood with 3 violent, deafening strikes of his hammer. Blood welled up, dark and thick in the freezing air, staining the snow at his boots. He wiped his hand on his denim thigh and moved to the next post. For a week since the fever broke, and the truth of the letters was laid bare, this had been Cade's existence. He was a man possessed, driven by a punishing, relentless need to bleed out his guilt into the frozen earth. Words could not fix what his family had broken. Only sweat, blood, and agonizing labor could even begin to tip the scales. Dusk settled over the valley, painting the snow in deep, bruised shades of violet and indigo. Cade finally trudged back toward the cabin. He didn't come empty-handed. He stopped at the woodpile, loading his arms with split oak logs until his injured muscles screamed in protest, carrying double what any normal man would haul. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the rich, savory smell of a venison stew. Elara stood near the hearth, wrapping a warm shawl around her shoulders. Her strength was returning, the fever flush completely gone, leaving her pale but fiercely alert. The heavy oak door swung open. A blast of Arctic air swept into the room, followed by Cade. He looked like a casualty of war. His face was wind-burned raw, his jaw shadowed with a week's worth of dark scruff. Steam rose off his wet woolen coat in the heat of the cabin. He dropped the massive load of firewood into the iron bin with a heavy crash, then immediately turned his back to the warmth of the room to strip off his snowy boots and bloody gloves. Elara watched him from the shadows. Every instinct she had honed on the brutal streets of Denver told her to trust no man. But the man who had occupied this cabin for the last 7 days was not the arrogant, hardened rancher who had stared her down on the porch. He was a ghost, haunting his own home in service to her and Leo. He hadn't slept in a bed since he found the letters. He spent his nights on the hard floorboards near the front door, wrapped in a single thin horse blanket, leaving the heavy quilts in the warm bedroom entirely to her and the boy. He ate only after they had finished, scraping whatever was left in the bottom of the cast-iron pot. "You're bleeding," Elara said. Her voice was quiet, breaking the heavy silence of the cabin. Cade paused, his back still to her. He glanced down at his torn palm, then quickly shoved his hand into his pocket. "Caught a barb on the east fence, it's nothing. It's dripping onto the floorboards, Cade." He stiffened, immediately looking down at the small red droplets on the wood. "I'll clean it up. I'm sorry." He moved to grab a rag, his head ducked, completely subservient to her comfort in his own home. "Sit down," Elara commanded. It wasn't a request. Cade stopped. He turned slowly, his gray eyes wary. Elara pointed to the heavy wooden chair near the stove. Hesitantly, he crossed the room and sat. Elara didn't offer a gentle smile, but the rigid hostility that had defined her for days was gone. She took a clean cloth, dipped it into a basin of hot water, and stepped into his space. Cade's breath hitched. She smelled like lye soap and the faint, sweet scent of the pine needles she used to sweep the floors. She took his large, battered hand in hers. His calluses were thick as armor, his knuckles bruised, but he let her hold his hand as if she held his very life. She pressed the hot cloth to the deep gash on his palm. Cade didn't wince, but his eyes never left her face. "You spent 3 hours on the icy roof yesterday patching a leak that only dripped in the hallway," Elara said softly, her eyes fixed on his wound. "You chopped enough wood to last until May, and you're leaving your rations in the pot." "You and the boy need your strength," Cade murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble. "And what happens when the wolves come back, or the cattle break the line and you're too weak to stand because you're starving yourself out of guilt?" Elara looked up, her dark eyes piercing straight through his defenses. "I won't let you kill yourself for my peace of mind, Cade. I need a living partner in this winter, not a martyr." The word partner hung in the air between them, heavy and profound. Cade swallowed hard, a muscle feathering in his jaw. I look at you," Cade whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "I look at the scars on your back, Elara. I look at Leo wearing a coat 3 sizes too big. Every time I close my eyes, I see those letters sitting in the dark while you were freezing. The guilt is eating me alive." "Then use it," Elara said fiercely, tying a strip of clean linen around his palm. "Don't bleed it out in the snow. Use it to build a roof over his head that won't ever leak again. Use it to make sure he never goes hungry." She stepped back, her voice dropping to a softer, unsteady cadence. "The past is ash, Cade. We can't live in it." Cade stared at her, overwhelmed by the sheer, unyielding grace of the woman standing before him. He gave a slow, deep nod. Later that evening, the cabin was quiet. Elara sat at the heavy oak table, mending a tear in one of Leo's flannel shirts by the amber glow of a kerosene lamp. Cade was seated on the floor near the hearth, his long legs stretched out toward the fire. In his uninjured hand, he held a block of soft cedar. In the other, a small whittling knife. He was working with slow, meticulous care. Leo, who had been quietly stacking wooden blocks on the rug, stopped. The 4-year-old boy stood up, his oversized socks sliding slightly on the floorboards. He took one step toward Cade, then another, until he was standing just 2 feet away. Cade froze. He didn't look up, not wanting to spook the boy, but he stilled the knife completely. Leo tilted his head, his gray eyes studying the wood taking shape in Cade's hands. It was the distinct, elegant curve of a horse's neck. "Is that for me?" Leo's voice was a tiny, hesitant whisper. It was the first time he had spoken directly to Cade without being prompted. Cade's heart slammed against his ribs. He slowly lowered the knife and held the half-finished wooden colt out in his bandaged palm. "It is," Cade said gently. "If you want it. He needs a little more work on his legs, but he's yours." Leo took a step closer. The firelight danced across his face. The boy didn't reach for the wooden toy. Instead, Leo's small, warm hand reached out and wrapped around Cade's thick, calloused, and bandaged thumb. It was a simple, terrifyingly innocent gesture of absolute trust. Cade stopped breathing. He stared down at the tiny fingers gripping his battered hand. A massive, shuddering breath racked his broad shoulders. He didn't pull away, he just let the boy hold him, anchoring him to the earth in a way nothing else ever had. At the table, Ilara stopped her sewing. She looked at the massive, scarred rancher sitting on the floor, allowing himself to be entirely captivated by the grip of a 4-year-old boy. The wall of ice Ilara had built around her heart for 5 years, a wall she thought was impenetrable, finally cracked. A single hot tear slipped down her cheek, catching the lamplight before it soaked into the flannel shirt in her lap. She didn't wipe it away. For the first time since the stagecoach dropped her in this frozen hell, Ilara Vance looked at Cade Sterling and allowed herself to believe that they were finally, truly, home. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the relentless shriek of the Montana wind died. The silence that followed was heavy and profound, ringing in the ears like a struck bell. The blizzard had finally broken, leaving behind a world buried in pristine, blinding white under a sky of brittle, cloudless blue. The sun glared off the frozen drifts, sharp enough to make a man's eyes water. Inside the cabin, the sudden quiet felt like a physical weight lifting. Cade stood by the window, a steaming cup of chicory coffee in his hand, watching the icicles drip sluggishly from the eaves. Behind him he could hear the soft scrape of a wooden spoon against cast iron as Ilara stirred porridge, and the quiet, concentrated hum of Leo playing with his newly finished wooden horse on the rug. It was a fragile, domestic peace. Cade closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the mug seep into his bandaged palm. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine that the rest of the world didn't exist. Then, the silence shattered. It wasn't the wind this time. It was the heavy, rhythmic crunch of hooves breaking through the crust of the snow. Multiple horses. Cade's eyes snapped open. He set his mug down on the windowsill with a sharp clatter. Through the frosted glass, 3 riders materialized at the edge of the tree line, their mounts chest-deep in the drifts, pushing hard toward the cabin. "Get away from the window," Cade ordered, his voice dropping an octave into a hard, dangerous register. Ilara didn't ask questions. The tone in his voice was enough. She immediately dropped her spoon, scooped Leo off the rug, and moved swiftly into the shadows of the bedroom, keeping the child quiet against her chest. Cade moved to the door. He didn't reach for his coat. He reached for the heavy leather gun belt slung over the back of a chair. He buckled it around his waist, checking the cylinder of his Colt .45 by instinct. The metallic clicks were deafening in the quiet cabin. He stepped out onto the porch, the freezing air biting through his flannel shirt. The 3 riders halted their exhausted, steaming horses in the yard. The 2 men flanking the leader were hired guns, rough, hard-eyed drifters with their hands resting too close to their holsters. But it was the man in the center who made Cade's blood run cold. Silas Thorne. The cattle baron sat tall in his custom saddle, enveloped in an expensive, heavy wolfskin coat. He was a man of wealth and ruthless ambition, his face heavily lined, his eyes as cold and dead as river stones. Silas had been Elias Sterling's business partner years ago, until greed had fractured their alliance. "Morning, Cade," Silas called out, his voice smooth and deceptively cordial, though his breath plumed in the freezing air. "Rough winter you're having out here on the edge of nothing." "It was quiet until about a minute ago, Silas," Cade replied, his boots planted shoulder-width apart on the porch boards. His right hand hung loose, inches from the worn walnut grip of his Colt. "State your business and get off my land." Silas chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. He patted the neck of his massive bay gelding. "Your land? Now that's where the confusion lies, boy. I figured with your old man dead and buried and you struggling to keep a handful of half-starved steers alive, it was time to settle accounts." Silas reached inside his heavy fur coat and pulled out a folded piece of thick parchment. He held it up in the glare of the morning sun. "Promissory note," Silas declared. "Signed by Elias Sterling 5 years ago. He leveraged this entire valley to me to cover his bad debts. I've been generous letting you squat here, Cade. But generosity has an expiration date." Cade's jaw tightened. "My father left no debts. I've seen the ledgers." "You saw what he wanted you to see," Silas sneered, his cordial mask slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "The deed is mine. I'm calling it in." Before Cade could respond, the cabin door creaked open behind him. Cade shifted slightly, throwing his arm back to block whoever was coming out, but Ilara sidestepped his arm. She stepped out onto the frozen porch, the bitter wind whipping the dark skirts of her wool dress around her ankles. Silas Thorne's cold eyes snapped to her. A cruel, knowing smirk twisted his lips. "Well now," Silas drawled, looking Ilara up and down with blatant disrespect. "Word in town was you hired a cook for the winter. But looking at her, I'd say you just took in a stray. A pretty unwed little thing to keep your bed warm while you play rancher. Is the bastard child inside, too?" The world turned red. Cade's hand moved in a blinding blur. His fingers wrapped around the grip of his Colt, ready to clear leather and put a bullet straight through the Baron's heart for daring to speak to her that way. But a sound stopped him. Clack, clack. The sharp, unmistakable metallic ratcheting of a lever-action rifle, chambering a round, echoed off the log walls of the cabin. Cade froze. Silas's smirk vanished instantly. The two hired guns stiffened, their hands freezing over their holsters. Ilara stood shoulder to shoulder with Cade. In her hands she held his heavy Winchester rifle. The stock was tucked perfectly into her shoulder, her cheek pressed against the cold steel, her dark eyes staring dead down the iron sights. The barrel was aimed directly at the center of Silas Thorne's chest. Her hands didn't shake, not even a fraction of an inch. "Say another word about my son," Ilara said. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a terrifyingly calm, dead-level promise that carried over the snow. "Say one more word, and I will paint this snow with you." Silas stared at the muzzle of the rifle, the color draining from his weathered face. He looked at Ilara, realizing with sudden sharp clarity that the woman holding the gun had nothing to lose and absolutely no fear of pulling the trigger. He looked at Cade, whose hand was still locked on his revolver, his gray eyes burning with lethal intent. The Baron was outmatched. A shootout here today would leave them all bleeding out in the drifts. Silas slowly, deliberately raised his empty hands, a placating gesture that fooled no one. He tucked the forged deed back inside his fur coat. "No need for hysterics, little lady," Silas said, pulling his horse's reins, backing the animal up a few paces. He looked back at Cade, his eyes flashing with venom. "The pass is snowed in, Cade. You're trapped here for now, but when the spring thaw hits, I'm coming back, and I'm bringing the sheriff and the law with me. You're off this land, Sterling, one way or another." Silas yanked his horse's head around. He spurred the animal hard, and the three riders plunged back into the deep snow, retreating toward the tree line. Cade didn't move until they were completely out of sight, swallowed by the glaring white horizon. He let out a long, ragged breath, his hand slowly falling away from his colt. He turned his head to look at the woman standing beside him. Elara slowly lowered the Winchester. The adrenaline was draining from her, leaving her pale and trembling in the freezing air. She lowered her head, taking a shaky breath. Cade reached out. Gently, he took the heavy rifle from her freezing, raw hands. He set it against the cabin wall, then took a step closer to her. He didn't say a word. He just reached out, wrapped his large, warm hand around the back of her neck, and pulled her forehead to his chest. Elara let out a shuddering sigh, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his flannel shirt. She leaned into his solid warmth, anchoring herself against him. "He's not taking this place," Cade murmured into her dark hair, his voice a fierce, unbreakable vow. "He's not taking our home." Elara closed her eyes, listening to the steady, thundering beat of his heart. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't facing the monsters alone. They had an enemy, but standing together in the freezing Montana sun, they had never been stronger. The false spring lasted exactly 2 days before the sky turned the color of bruised iron. By nightfall, the worst blizzard of the decade slammed into the Montana territory. It wasn't just snow. It was a blinding horizontal wall of ice driven by winds that threatened to tear the cabin from its very foundations. The temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. But the most terrifying sound in the cabin wasn't the shrieking wind outside. It was the wet, ragged rattle coming from the bedroom. Cade stood in the doorway, his massive frame tense with a helpless, suffocating terror. On the bed, Leo was drowning in his own lungs. It had started that morning as a dry cough. By midnight, it had escalated into severe lung fever. The boy's skin was a burning, unnatural crimson, slick with sweat. Yet he shivered violently beneath 3 heavy quilts. His small chest heaved, fighting for every shallow, gurgling breath. Elara knelt beside the mattress, her face pale and drawn tight with panic. She was frantically pressing a steaming cloth infused with eucalyptus and mustard seed to the boy's chest, a frontier remedy that was failing completely. "Breathe, Leo. Just look at Mama and breathe," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Leo's eyelids fluttered. His lips were taking on a faint, horrifying tint of blue. He turned his head weakly toward the doorway. "Papa," the boy rasped, the word barely a puff of air. Cade felt as if a rusted blade had been driven straight up under his ribs. He crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to his knees beside Elara. He placed his large, calloused hand gently against the boy's burning cheek. "I'm right here, little man," Cade whispered, his voice thick. "I'm right here." Elara looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and completely stripped of her usual armor. She was terrified. "The fever is spiking, Cade. The poultice isn't working. The congestion is too deep. If we don't clear his lungs—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. On the frontier, pneumonia in a child this young was almost always a death sentence. Cade stood up. The desperate, paralyzed fear vanished, replaced by a cold, absolute resolve. He turned and walked to the chair where his heavy winter gear hung. "Keep him sitting up," Cade ordered, pulling on his thick wool trousers and heavy leather riding boots. "Boil more water. Keep the steam going." Elara stopped wiping Leo's forehead. She stared at Cade as he shrugged into his heavy buffalo hide coat. "Cade, what are you doing?" "I'm going to town," he said, wrapping a thick woolen scarf tightly around his neck and lower face. "I'm getting Dr. Harrison." "It's 20 miles, Elara cried out, abandoning the rag and standing up. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the heavy fur of his coat. "You can't see 10 feet out that door. The snow is chest high on a man. You'll freeze to death before you make it halfway." Cade reached up and gently covered her trembling hand with his leather-gloved one. He looked down into her terrified eyes. "I am bringing the doctor back to this cabin, Elara," Cade said, his voice a low, unshakable vow. or I am dying in the snow. There is no third option." He didn't wait for her to argue. He leaned down, pressed a hard, desperate kiss to her forehead, and walked out into the howling abyss. The cold hit him like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture in his eyes and nose. He fought his way to the barn, leaning his entire body weight into the wind. Inside the freezing, pitch-black barn, Cade lit a single lantern. He walked past his sturdy geldings and went straight to the reinforced stall at the very back. Inside stood Midnight. The black stallion was a monster of a horse, standing 17 hands high, packed with dense, explosive muscle and a notoriously wicked temper. He was a purebred Morgan, Cade's prized breeding stud, and the entire financial future of the Sterling Ranch. He was also the only animal in the valley with the sheer, brute strength to bust through chest-high snowdrifts. Cade threw a heavy blanket in his saddle over the stallion's back. Midnight pinned his ears flat and danced nervously, sensing the deadly atmospheric pressure dropping outside. Cade grabbed the stallion's halter, pulling the massive head down until his forehead rested against the horse's velvet nose. "I know," Cade whispered roughly into the freezing dark. "I'm asking you for everything tonight, boy, but I need you to save my son." Cade swung up into the saddle, kicked the barn doors open, and plunged Midnight into the white death. The ride was a blur of agonizing, freezing torture. There was no road. There were no landmarks. The world was a chaotic, swirling vortex of ice. Cade navigated entirely by instinct and the faint, shifting direction of the wind. Midnight fought like a demon. The stallion lunged through drifts that swallowed him up to his chest, plunging and leaping in a grueling, rhythmic battle against the snow. Ice encrusted Cade's eyelashes, sealing them half shut. The cold seeped through his buffalo coat, biting into his bones, turning his hands and feet into heavy, numb blocks of wood. "Keep moving," Cade chanted in his mind, his jaw locked tight against the shivering. "For Leo. For Elara." Hours bled away. The agonizing physical toll on the horse was becoming horribly apparent. Midnight's breaths were no longer sharp snorts. They were ragged, desperate wheezes. The stallion's massive chest was lathered in sweat that instantly froze into a jagged coat of white rime. Every lunge through the snow was weaker than the last. "Come on, Midnight," Cade urged, his own voice a hoarse, frozen croak. He leaned forward, taking as much weight off the horse's back as he could. "Don't quit on me." Suddenly, through a break in the swirling whiteout, Cade saw it. A faint, flickering yellow glow. The lights of the town. Midnight stumbled. The horse's knees buckled under the snow, but Cade pulled fiercely on the reins, keeping the stallion's head up. "Just a little further. Ha!" They hit the edge of the town's main street, the snow slightly more packed between the buildings. Cade drove the exhausted horse straight toward the small wooden clinic beside the church. Midnight halted in front of the doctor's porch, his entire massive frame shaking violently. Cade practically fell out of the saddle. His legs gave out when his boots hit the ground, and he crawled the last 3 feet up the wooden steps. He hammered his numb, frozen fists against the oak door with everything he had left. "Harrison!" Cade roared, his voice cracking. "Open the door!" Locks tumbled. The door flew open, revealing the older, gray-bearded doctor in his nightshirt, holding a kerosene lamp. Dr. Harrison stared in absolute shock at the frozen, snow-encrusted giant on his porch. "Sterling? Good God, man, how did you survive out there?" "My boy," Cade gasped, grabbing the doctor's nightshirt. "Lung fever. He's dying. You have to come now." "Let me get my bag," Harrison said immediately, pivoting back into the warmth of the clinic. "Get inside, you're freezing to death." Cade didn't go inside. He turned back around to look at the street. Midnight stood perfectly still in the driving snow. The massive black stallion lowered his majestic head. A long, shuddering sigh ripped through the horse's chest, blowing a fine mist of bloody vapor from his nostrils. Then the stallion's front legs buckled. With a heavy, muffled thud, the 1,000-pound horse collapsed onto his side in the snow. "No," Cade whispered. He scrambled down the steps, falling to his knees beside the animal. He ripped his thick gloves off with his teeth and pressed his bare, freezing hands against the horse's lathered neck. There was no pulse. The stallion's massive heart had literally burst from the sheer, unimaginable strain of breaking the trail. Cade bowed his head. The hardened cowboy who had fought Silas Thorne in the brutal frontier without flinching buried his face in the coarse, frozen mane of the dead horse. A single, ragged sob tore free from his chest, swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Midnight hadn't just been a horse. He had been Cade's pride, his wealth, his independence, and he had given it all away without a second thought. "Sterling!" Dr. Harrison emerged onto the porch, fully dressed in heavy winter gear, carrying a worn leather medical bag. He looked at the massive black shape half buried in the snow, then at Cade, kneeling beside it. The doctor's eyes softened with a grim, solemn understanding of what the frontier demanded. "I'll hitch my draft team to the cutter," Dr. Harrison shouted over the storm. "They're fresh. We'll follow the trench you broke on the way in." Cade didn't look back at the warmth of the clinic. He stood up slowly, the biting wind instantly freezing the tears on his face. He wiped his jaw, his gray eyes hardening into chips of pure ice. The grief would have to wait. "Hitch them fast, Doc," Cade said, turning his face back toward the howling black abyss of the mountains. "My son is waiting." The agonizing wait inside the cabin was measured not in hours, but in the shallow, rattling breaths of a 4-year-old boy. When the heavy oak door finally burst open, slamming against the log wall in a flurry of driven snow, Elara didn't scream. She simply dropped the cooling rag into the iron basin and stared as Cade hauled Dr. Harrison over the threshold. Cade looked less like a man and more like a frozen corpse dragged from a glacier. His buffalo coat was encased in a solid shell of ice. Frostbite painted his cheekbones in stark, bloodless white, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. But his hands, raw, trembling, and stripped of their gloves, firmly gripped the doctor's heavy leather medical bag. Harrison wasted no time on pleasantries. He stripped his snow-caked coat, rolled up his sleeves in the freezing cabin, and went straight to the bed. "Pneumonia," the doctor confirmed grimly, listening to Leo's chest through a wooden stethoscope. "Deep in both lungs. You got me here just in time, Sterling, but it's going to be a wicked fight." For the next 10 hours, the cabin became a battlefield. Harrison deployed every weapon in his arsenal, tincture of aconite to slow the racing pulse, heavy mustard plasters that burned the skin to draw out the deep congestion, and a crude tent made of heavy quilts over the bed to trap the steam of boiling water and camphor. Cade refused to rest. He fed the stove until the iron glowed cherry red, his massive frame moving with a stiff mechanical desperation. Every time he looked at the bed, his gray eyes were haunted by the ghost of a massive black stallion bleeding out in the snow, a price he would pay 1,000 times over if it meant the boy drew another breath. It happened just before dawn. The shrieking wind outside finally began to die, dropping into a low, exhausted moan. Under the heavy quilt tent, the horrific wet rattle in Leo's chest shifted. It caught, hitched, and broke into a deep, violent fit of coughing that brought up the dark phlegm choking his lungs. When the coughing subsided, the terrifying wheeze was gone. Leo drew a long, clear, shuddering breath. Dr. Harrison pressed 2 fingers to the boy's pulse, a profound relief washing over his tired, lined face. "The fever has broken," the doctor whispered. "His lungs are clearing. He's going to make it." Elara collapsed against the foot of the bed, burying her face in the mattress as a ragged, silent sob tore through her shoulders. 5 years of absolute terror, of fighting the world alone to keep this child alive, finally drained out of her in a flood of hot tears. Cade stood near the hearth, the heavy iron poker slipping from his numb, bandaged hands to clatter onto the stone hearth. He didn't move toward the bed. He just stared at the rise and fall of his son's chest, his broad shoulders slumping as the adrenaline that had kept him upright for 24 hours finally evaporated. He sank heavily into the wooden chair by the fire. Within seconds, the exhausted rancher was dead to the world, his chin resting on his chest, his battered hands hanging limply at his sides. Late the next night, Dr. Harrison was snoring softly on a bedroll near the stove. Leo was in a deep, healing sleep, the color finally returning to his pale cheeks. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the hearth. Elara stood up from the edge of the mattress. She walked quietly across the room to where Cade was still sleeping in the heavy wooden chair. She looked at the man before her. His face was gaunt, the dark stubble on his jaw making the frost-bitten patches on his cheeks look even more stark. His hands were a ruined mess of cuts, blisters, and freezing burns. Dr. Harrison had told her about midnight. He had told her how the purebred stallion's heart had burst, breaking the trail, and how Cade had crawled the rest of the way to the clinic door. Elara reached out. Her fingers, light as a feather, brushed a stray lock of dark hair away from Cade's closed eyes. The boy she had loved in Denver was gone. He had been a charming, reckless illusion. But the man sitting in this chair, the man who bled into the snow, who sacrificed his prized legacy without a second thought, who tore his own family's history apart to find the truth, was profoundly, unshakably real. The fortress Elara had built around her heart crumbled into dust. She knelt beside his chair. She didn't wake him. She simply rested her forehead against his heavy, wool-clad knee, letting her own tears soak into the rough fabric. "I forgive you, Cade," she whispered into the quiet, firelit room, her voice trembling with an overwhelming, terrifying love. "I forgive you, and I'm not going anywhere." The thaw did not come gently to Montana. Weeks bled into a month, and the deep freeze finally cracked. The sound of it was deafening, massive sheets of ice groaning and snapping on the rivers like cannon fire. The snowpack began to rot, turning the pristine white drifts into a treacherous, churning sea of gray slush and thick, sucking mud. Inside the cabin, the emotional thaw was just as profound. Leo was fully recovered, his childish energy returning with a vengeance. He followed Cade everywhere, a tiny shadow in oversized boots. Cade taught him how to carve, how to oil a saddle, and how to read the clouds. And when Cade looked at Elara now, there was no longer an impenetrable wall of guilt between them. There was a quiet, burning reverence. They moved around each other with a new magnetic gravity, hands brushing as they passed the coffee pot, lingering glances over the dinner table that spoke of a fire waiting to be unleashed once the war outside was won. Because they both knew the war wasn't over. The melting snow meant the mountain pass was open. It happened on a Tuesday morning. The air smelled sharply of wet pine and turning earth. The relentless dripping of water from the eaves was suddenly drowned out by the heavy splashing rhythm of multiple horses tearing through the deep mud of the yard. Cade was at the woodpile, his axe buried in a stump. He froze, his gray eyes snapping toward the tree line. 5 riders broke through the clearing. At the center, immaculate in his dark broadcloth coat, sat Silas Thorne. But it was the man riding beside him that made Cade's blood run cold. It was Sheriff Miller. A silver star was pinned to his heavy canvas coat. Behind them rode 3 of Silas's hired guns, their Winchesters resting casually across their saddle horns. "Get in the house, Leo," Cade ordered sharply. The boy, who had been stacking kindling, dropped the wood and sprinted for the porch. Elara emerged from the cabin before Leo even reached the steps. She pushed the boy inside, closing the heavy oak door behind him. She didn't retreat. She stood on the porch, her dark eyes locking onto Silas Thorne with absolute lethal hatred. Cade walked slowly across the muddy yard, his boots sinking deep with every step. He stopped between the riders and the porch, his right hand resting casually on his hip, inches from the worn walnut grip of his Colt. "Sheriff," Cade acknowledged, his voice a low, warning rumble. "Long ride out here just to enjoy the mud." Sheriff Miller looked uncomfortable. He was an honest man, but a man bound by the letter of the law. He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket, the paper stark white against his muddy coat. "I take no pleasure in this, Cade," Miller said, his voice carrying over the sound of the melting runoff. "But Silas here brought a registered promissory note and a deed of forfeiture to my office. Signed by your father, witnessed by a notary. The debt wasn't paid. The court order is signed. The property belongs to the Thorne Cattle Company." Silas Thorne smiled, a thin, venomous stretching of his lips. He looked past Cade, his dead eyes fixing on Elara standing on the porch. "I told you I'd be back when the ice melted, Sterling," Silas drawled, resting his hands on his saddle horn. "I'm a reasonable man. I'll give you and your stray 1 hour to pack your bags and clear off my land. After that, you're trespassing, and the sheriff here knows what the law says about dealing with armed trespassers." Cade didn't look at Silas. He looked at Sheriff Miller. "My father never signed that land away, Miller," Cade said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "That paper is a forgery." "Take it up with the territorial judge in Helena, boy," Silas sneered. "But right now you're standing on my dirt." The 3 hired guns subtly shifted their weight, their hands tightening on their rifles. The tension in the muddy yard snapped tight as a wire. Cade planted his feet in the freezing mud. He didn't draw his gun, but his entire body coiled into a weapon ready to strike. Behind him, he heard the faint, terrifyingly familiar metallic clack of Elara chambering around in the Winchester from the porch shadows. "I'm not going to Helena, Silas," Cade said, his voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper that carried a promise of absolute violence. "And I'm not leaving this land." The heavy, damp air of the spring thaw swallowed Cade's words, leaving a ringing, lethal silence in the muddy yard. Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, the leather creaking loudly. "Cade, don't do this. I have a sworn order. If you draw that weapon, my men and I are legally bound to shoot you down." Silas Thorne's smile widened into a predatory, satisfied grin. This was exactly what the cattle baron wanted. He didn't just want the land. He wanted the last remaining sterling dead in the mud, completely justified by the badge pinned to Miller's chest. Silas swung his leg over his saddle and dismounted. The squelch of his expensive polished leather boots sinking into the ankle-deep muck was sickeningly loud. He patted the neck of his horse and began to walk, not toward Cade, but past him, making a deliberate, arrogant beeline straight for the cabin porch. "Let's see what kind of squalor you've been keeping this stray in, boy," Silas taunted, his eyes fixed on the shadows of the porch. "Maybe I'll have the sheriff take the bastard child to the orphanage in Helena after they cart your body away." Cade's vision went entirely black at the edges. His thumb brushed the textured hammer of his Colt .45. His muscles coiled like spring steel. He knew it was a trap. He knew the 3 hired guns had their rifles leveled at his spine, and he knew Miller would fire if provoked. But he would die 1,000 times over before he let Silas Thorne put a single filthy boot on the porch where his family stood. Cade's fingers twitched, ready to draw and drag Silas to hell with him. But on the porch, Elara saw the trap perfectly. Her mind, honed razor-sharp by years of surviving the brutal, unforgiving streets of Denver, calculated the odds in a fraction of a second. If Cade drew his gun, he would be slaughtered. If she fired the Winchester rifle she held, they would both hang for murdering a man in front of the county sheriff. Elara didn't panic. She didn't scream. With a loud metallic clatter, she dropped the Winchester rifle onto the pine floorboards. Silas chuckled, assuming she had surrendered. He took his first heavy step onto the wooden stairs of the porch. He didn't see her hand drop to the heavy, hickory-handled, wood-splitting axe resting against the porch rail. It happened in a terrifying, slow-motion blur. Elara gripped the handle with both raw, calloused hands. She pivoted on her heel using the momentum of her entire body and swung the massive iron head through the damp spring air. Silas's eyes widened in sheer sudden horror as the blade blurred toward his skull. Crack! The deafening sound of iron violently splitting solid wood echoed across the valley. Elara buried the heavy axe blade 3 inches deep into the solid oak door frame. The rusted iron was lodged exactly 1 inch from the bridge of Silas Thorne's nose. A shower of sharp wood splinters exploded outward, stinging the Baron's pale cheek. Silas froze, entirely paralyzed, his breath hitching in his throat. If he moved his head a fraction to the right, he would cut his own face on the razor-sharp edge. Elara didn't flinch. She leaned in close, her dark eyes burning with a ferocious maternal lethality that made the hardened cattle baron tremble. "This is sterling land," she whispered, her voice a deadly, venomous hiss that carried over the dripping snow. "Take another step and welcome to hell. Hold your fire!" Sheriff Miller roared from the yard, waving his hands frantically at the hired guns who had raised their rifles. "Nobody shoots!" Cade used the stunned, breathless silence to step up behind Silas. He didn't draw his gun. Instead, he reached inside his heavy flannel coat. "You want to talk about the law, Miller?" Cade called out, pulling a small black leather-bound book from his inner pocket. He tossed it in a high arc through the damp air. Sheriff Miller caught the book against his chest. "Found that a month ago, hidden in the lining of my father's old winter coat," Cade said, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. "Along with 5 stolen letters. That is Elias Sterling's private ledger. It details every single cent Silas Thorne embezzled from their partnership 5 years ago. And more importantly, it details the exact date Thorne tried to force a fraudulent deed transfer." Silas's face turned the color of old ash. "That's a lie," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically toward his men. "The boy forged it." "The ink is 5 years dry, Silas," Cade countered smoothly. "And the handwriting is undeniably Elias's. The signature on your eviction notice is a fake, Sheriff. The proof is right there in your hands." Miller flipped the ledger open. He scanned the cramped, meticulous numbers and the furious, paranoid notes written in Elias Sterling's unmistakable scrawl. The sheriff's face hardened into a mask of pure disgust. Slowly, deliberately, Sheriff Miller closed the ledger. He drew his service revolver from his hip and leveled it directly at Silas Thorne's chest. "Silas Thorne," Miller said, his voice devoid of any previous warmth. "Step away from that woman. You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and attempted grand larceny." "You can't do this," Silas spat, taking a shaky step backward, away from the terrifying blade of Elara's axe. He looked wildly at his 3 hired guns. "Shoot them! I pay your wages!" The 3 drifters looked at the sheriff's aimed gun, then at Cade Sterling, who was now standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman who had just nearly cleaved a man's skull in 2. The hired guns looked at each other, slowly lowered their rifles, and backed their horses away. They were paid to intimidate a broke rancher, not to die in the mud fighting the county law. "You'll be waiting in the territorial prison in Deer Lodge for a judge, Silas," Miller said, pulling a pair of heavy iron cuffs from his saddlebag. "And I reckon they don't take kindly to rich men who steal from dead partners." The handcuffs ratcheted shut with a loud, satisfying click. Cade watched as the sheriff hauled the furious, cursing cattle baron up onto his horse and tied his hands to the saddle horn. The small posse turned their mounts, trudging back through the deep, churning mud toward the pass, leaving the Sterling ranch exactly as they had found it. The heavy, suffocating threat that had hung over the valley for 5 years was finally, permanently extinguished. The silence returned to the yard, broken only by the steady, peaceful dripping of the melting snow. Cade turned to look at Elara. She was still gripping the handle of the axe, her knuckles white, her chest heaving as the adrenaline slowly drained from her veins. Gently, Cade reached out. He wrapped his large, scarred hands over hers, loosening her death grip on the hickory handle. He pulled the axe free from the doorframe and set it down on the porch boards. Then he pulled her into his arms. Elara buried her face against his neck, wrapping her arms tightly around his waist. Cade buried his face in her dark hair, breathing in the scent of her, feeling the solid, living warmth of the woman who had fought a monster to protect their home. The cabin door creaked open. Leo peeked his head out, his gray eyes wide. "Papa?" the boy asked quietly. "Are the bad men gone?" Cade pulled back just enough to look at his son, then at the woman who held his entire heart. A slow, genuine smile broke across his scarred, weary face, the first true smile he had worn in 5 years. "Yeah, little man," Cade said, his voice thick with overwhelming, profound relief. "The bad men are gone. It's just us now." The brutal Montana winter did not simply end. It surrendered. The roaring blizzards and chest-high drifts melted away, replaced by the rushing, thunderous roar of mountain runoff filling the creeks. The mud dried into solid earth, and within weeks the valley exploded into a vibrant, blinding sea of sweet wildgrass and blooming purple lupine. With the changing of the season came the final, undeniable proof that the long nightmare was over. Word arrived in late May via a telegram delivered by Sheriff Miller. Silas Thorne had been tried in Helena. Faced with Elias Sterling's meticulous ledgers, the judge had shown no mercy. The corrupt cattle baron had been stripped of his stolen assets and sentenced to 20 hard years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. He would rot behind heavy iron bars, breaking rocks until his hands bled, while the land he had tried to steal flourished. For the first time in his life, Cade Sterling felt the suffocating weight of his family's toxic legacy completely lift from his shoulders. He owned the ranch, free and clear, but more importantly, he finally owned his soul. By late September, the air turned crisp, carrying the sweet scent of wild sage and wood smoke. The yard that had once been the site of a deadly standoff was now transformed. Long wooden tables were set up beneath the shade of the towering pines, groaning under the weight of roasted venison, fresh-baked bread, and wild berry pies. Fiddles tuned up in the background, their lively, scratching melodies echoing off the canyon walls. Half the county had made the trek out to the Sterling Ranch. Sheriff Miller, Dr. Harrison, and the neighboring ranchers whose cattle Cade had helped dig out of the snow during the worst of the freezes. They hadn't come for a tense, forced legal arrangement. They had come for a wedding. Cade stood near the porch steps, nervously twisting the brim of his clean Stetson in his large, scarred hands. He wore a crisp white cotton shirt and a dark vest, his jaw clean-shaven, though the faint white lines of frostbite still marked his cheekbones, a permanent badge of the winter he had conquered. The fiddle music softened into a slow, sweet ballad. The heavy oak door of the cabin opened. Cade's breath left him in a sudden, rushing exhale. Elara stepped out into the golden autumn sunlight. She didn't wear a white frilled gown bought from an expensive catalog. She wore a dress of deep, rich indigo wool that she had spent the last month painstakingly tailoring herself, reclaiming the skill that had once barely kept her alive, and using it now to create something beautiful. Her dark hair was swept up, held by a simple silver comb, and her eyes were bright and completely devoid of fear. Walking beside her, holding her hand, was Leo. The 4-year-old boy wore a miniature vest and a small, serious expression, practically puffing his chest out with pride as he escorted his mother to the man waiting at the bottom of the steps. Dr. Harrison stood waiting with a worn leather Bible. The crowd fell silent. When Elara reached Cade, she didn't wait for him to offer his arm. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in both of hers, her thumbs gently tracing the faded scars across his knuckles. "I didn't think I had any words left," Cade whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at her. He didn't care that half the county was watching, he only saw her. "I spent 5 years hating a ghost, Elara. And I spent a winter watching you fight demons I couldn't even comprehend. I don't deserve the grace you've shown me." Cade squeezed her hands, his gray eyes shining with absolute, unshakable devotion. "But before God and everyone here, I promise you this. I will spend the rest of my days making sure you never have to fight alone again. You are my heart. You are my home." Tears blurred Elara's vision, but a radiant, breathtaking smile broke across her face. "You rode into the ice for us, Cade," she answered, her voice ringing clear and steady in the crisp mountain air. "You tore down your own history to give us a future. I didn't need a perfect man. I needed a partner who would stand beside me when the wolves came to the door." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a fierce, intimate whisper. "You proved you'd bleed for us. Now we live for each other, Dr. Each." Harrison smiled, closing the heavy Bible. "By the power vested in me by the Montana Territory, and by the undeniable proof of the love standing before us, I pronounce you husband and wife." Cade didn't hesitate. He pulled Elara into his arms, wrapping his hands around her waist, and kissed her deeply. It wasn't the desperate, fleeting passion of a dark boarding house room 5 years ago. It was a kiss forged in fire and ice, rooted in survival, and anchored by a love that could never be broken. The crowd erupted into cheers. Leo tugged on Cade's trouser leg, and Cade broke the kiss just long enough to scoop the laughing boy up into his arms, holding his son and his wife against his chest as the fiddles launched into a joyous, foot-stomping reel. 3 years later, the July sun beat down on the lush, emerald-green pastures of the Sterling Ranch, turning the meandering creek into a ribbon of liquid diamonds. The harsh, deadly isolation of the cabin was a memory of a bygone era. The porch had been expanded to wrap entirely around the front of the house. Fat red tomatoes grew in heavy wooden planters, and the sound of hammering echoed from a brand-new, massive barn being raised near the tree line. The heavy oak door swung open, and Ilara stepped out into the warm summer breeze. She looked radiant. Her dark hair was braided loosely over one shoulder, and she rested her hand gently on the pronounced, heavy curve of her pregnant belly. She was due in less than a month. She leaned against the sturdy wooden porch rail, a peaceful, contented smile touching her lips as she looked out over the valley. Down in the tall grass of the pasture, Cade was working. His broad shoulders strained against his faded cotton shirt as he held the lead rope of a skittish but beautiful roan colt. The horse danced nervously, but Cade spoke to it in that low, steady, rumbling voice that could calm any storm. Standing right beside him, completely unafraid, was Leo. At 7 years old, the boy was shooting up like a weed, his shoulders already broadening to mirror the man standing next to him. Leo moved with a quiet, observant confidence, holding out a flat palm with a sugar cube, letting the nervous colt sniff his hand before gently taking the treat. Cade laughed, a deep, rich sound that echoed across the pasture. He reached down and effortlessly hoisted Leo by the waist, setting the boy squarely onto the bare back of the colt. Leo gripped the horse's mane, his chest swelling with pride. He looked down at the massive, scarred rancher who had become his entire world. "Papa?" Leo asked, his voice carrying clearly on the summer wind up to the porch. "Yeah, little man," Cade answered, keeping a firm, protective hand on the colt's flank. Leo looked toward the house, his gray eyes fixing on Ilara standing on the porch, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "When the new baby comes," Leo asked, his brow furrowing in serious 7-year-old thought, "do you think they'll have your eyes too?" Cade stopped. He looked up the gentle slope of the yard, his gaze meeting Ilara's. The distance between them vanished in an instant, bridged by a profound, soul-deep connection that had only grown stronger with every passing season. He looked at the woman who had braved the slums, the stagecoach, the blizzard, and the barren. A slow, devoted smile spread across Cade's weathered face. He reached up, playfully ruffling Leo's dark hair. "I don't know, Leo," Cade said, his voice thick with a love so vast it rivaled the Montana sky. "But I just hope to God they have your mother's grit." On the porch, Ilara laughed, the sound bright and musical, wrapping around her family like a warm blanket. She turned her face up to the sun, breathing in the sweet scent of the wild grass, knowing with absolute, unshakable certainty that they had fought the wild frontier, and they had finally, truly won.